The phone didn't ring. It just lit up the dark room, a silent blue supernova against the high thread count sheets. My heart hammered a rhythm that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with the name on the screen. Sarah. The woman who had insisted on strict boundaries for 3 months. The message was just an address, no subject line. Logic said to ignore it, but my hand was already closing around my car keys before my mind could argue. I was already moving, pulled by a gravity that started months ago, back in a boardroom that felt colder than it actually was. I don't do chaos. My entire career is built on the architecture of precision. I run a fintech firm where strategy is a cold, hard science. I value clean lines, predictable outcomes, and the quiet power of a balanced ledger. Then came the merger. And then came Sarah. She was the founder of the creative tech agency we were acquiring, and she was everything I wasn't. Where I was steel and glass, she was neon and kinetic energy. The first meeting set the tone. We sat across from each other at the long mahogany table, the surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the tension in the room. "We need to set ground rules," she had said, leaning forward. Her hair was a deliberate kind of messy, her blazer structured but worn with a casual defiance that irritated me as much as it intrigued me. "This merger is going to be messy enough without personal complications. Strictly professional. No after-hours drinks, no blurring the lines. We keep this clean." I remember looking at her, really looking at her. The way she held her pen, like a weapon, or maybe a wand. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, but the heat behind her eyes was undeniable. It was a challenge. She wasn't asking for boundaries. She was erecting a wall because she felt the pull too. I could feel it vibrating in the space between us, a low-frequency hum that threatened to shatter the glass walls. "Agreed," I said. My voice was steady, practiced, the CEO voice. "Efficiency is my priority. I have no interest in complications." It was a lie, a bold-faced, unflinching lie. The moment the words left my mouth, I wanted to complicate everything. I wanted to see what would happen if I reached across that table and dismantled her composure. The weeks that followed were an exercise in torture. She became a study in contradiction. In meetings, she was brilliant, cutting through my data with intuitive leaps that infuriated my analysts and delighted the board. She wore her brilliance like armor. But I saw the cracks. I saw the way her gaze lingered on my hands when I adjusted the projector. I saw the way she shifted in her chair when I leaned in to point out a discrepancy in the quarterly projections. The rule became a living thing, a third party in every room we occupied. It wasn't a barrier. It was a lens that magnified every accidental brush of fabric, every shared silence. The boardroom became a theater of denial. We spoke in jargon, synergies, integration verticals, equity splits. But the subtext was a different language entirely. It was a language of breath held too long, of glances that lasted a fraction of a second past polite. I found myself analyzing her movements with the same scrutiny I applied to market trends. The way she bit her lip when she was thinking. The way she tapped her fingers against her ceramic mug. A chaotic, restless rhythm that seemed to sync with my own pulse. Her denial was a wall built of glass and expectation. Transparent, but impenetrable. I told myself it was just the stress of the acquisition. High stakes create high tension. It's a biological fact, not an emotional one. I tried to bury the feeling under spreadsheets and due diligence reports. But you can't audit desire. You can't regulate the way the air charges when a specific person walks into the room. And as the deadlines tightened and the late nights became mandatory, the walls we had built started to feel less like protection and more like a cage. We were locking ourselves in together, and the oxygen was getting thin. The city lights outside would blur into streaks of amber and red, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows, isolating us in a bubble of artificial light and unspoken intent. The silence stretched like a merger agreement, dense with clauses we were both afraid to read aloud. I didn't build the wall because I hated her. I built it because I knew exactly what would happen if I didn't. Linda walked into a room, and the atmosphere reorganized itself around her. She was all sharp angles and terrifying competence. A woman who lived in a world of binary choices and absolute outcomes. My agency was my life, my chaotic, beautiful mess of a creation that thrived on ambiguity and creative pivots. Merging with her fintech empire was the smart play, the logical next step to scale up. But Linda herself? She was a variable I couldn't account for in any algorithm. That first meeting, when I laid down the law about strict boundaries, my heart was beating so hard I thought she could see it pulsing in my throat. It wasn't a boundary. It was a dam against a flood I wasn't ready to drown in. 3 months later, the dam was leaking. It was 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. The office was deserted, a cavern of shadowed cubicles and the low, persistent hum of the server room down the hall. The cleaning crew had come and gone, leaving the smell of lemon polish and empty trash bins. The city outside was a grid of indifferent lights, but inside, the world had shrunk down to the 4 feet of space between us at the conference table. We were finalizing the investor pitch deck. It was tedious work, the kind that usually made my eyes glaze over. But tonight, every nerve ending was singing. She was sitting too close. That was the problem with these late nights. The professional distance we maintained during the day evaporated when the sun went down and the building emptied out. She had discarded her blazer hours ago, rolling up the sleeves of a crisp white shirt that looked impossibly unwrinkled despite the hour. I was acutely aware of the line of her forearm, the way the muscles shifted when she typed. I found myself tracking her breathing, matching my own rhythm to hers without meaning to. It was maddening. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the static of everything we weren't saying. "We need to adjust the user acquisition cost here," she said, her voice low. It vibrated in my chest, a frequency I was becoming dangerously attuned to. She leaned in toward my laptop screen, bringing a wave of her scent with her. It wasn't flowery or sweet. It was sandalwood and something clean, like fresh linen or the air before a storm. It was intoxicating, a sharp, grounding contrast to the stale, recycled office air. I leaned in too, drawn by a magnetism I was too tired to fight. "Which slide?" I asked, though I knew exactly which slide. I just wanted her to show me. She reached out, her hand hovering over the trackpad to point at a graph. "Slide 12, the retention metrics." Her finger grazed mine. It wasn't a grab, just a brush of skin against skin, accidental in theory, but deliberate in its duration. Neither of us pulled away. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that made the breath hitch in my throat. I stared at our hands, mine slightly ink-stained from nervous doodling, hers manicured and precise. The contrast was stark, yet they looked right together. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, terrifying intimacy. The cursor blinked on the screen, a steady heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. She turned her head. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the slight parting of her lips as she realized how close we were. The pitch deck, the investors, the millions of dollars on the table, it all dissolved into background noise. "The integration strategy," I murmured, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, rougher than I intended. "It needs to be seamless." I wasn't talking about the software anymore, and she knew it. The subtext was so loud it was practically shouting. "Yes," she whispered, her gaze dropping to my mouth before snapping back to my eyes, dark and unreadable. Seamless. The word hung there, a promise or a threat, I couldn't tell which. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I wanted to lean across that inch of space. I wanted to ruin the merger and the timeline and the rules I had set myself. But fear is a powerful anchor. I cleared my throat and pulled my hand back, the loss of contact feeling like a physical chill. "Right. I'll update the figures." I turned back to the screen, typing nonsense just to look busy, my heart rate refusing to settle. The moment passed, but the energy remained, coiled and waiting. Then the sound changed. A low rumble started outside, growing into a roar as the sky opened up. Rain lashed against the glass, heavy and sudden, sealing us in even tighter. The weather didn't just turn, it collapsed. By the time we made it to the lobby, the street was a river, the gutters overflowing with the runoff of a violent storm. My usual town car was gridlocked 3 avenues over, a logistical failure that usually made my teeth grind. But tonight, standing under the awning with the wind whipping rain against our ankles, the disruption felt inevitable. Sarah's rideshare app was the only thing connecting us to a way home. We were forced into the back of a beat-up sedan that smelled of pine air freshener and damp upholstery, a stark departure from the hermetically sealed luxury I used to insulate myself. It was small, too small. The windows were already fogged from the humidity, turning the city outside into a smear of indistinct neon. We were sealed in. I sat on the left, pressing myself against the door to maintain that crucial inch of space. But the physics of the ride had other plans. The driver took a corner too sharp, dodging a taxi, and gravity did the rest. We slid. My thigh pressed against hers, a solid, undeniable line of contact from knee to hip. I should have moved. That was the protocol. You apologize, you shift, you reestablish the boundary. But I didn't, and neither did she. The heat radiating between us was palpable, cutting through the damp chill of our wet coats. It was a physical weight, heavy and grounding. I could feel the damp wool of her trousers against my suit, the warmth of her skin seeping through the layers. It was distracting in a way that terrified me. My mind, usually a ticker tape of tasks and projections, went blank, static-filled by the proximity of her body. The sound of the rain hammering the roof was deafening, a chaotic drumbeat that matched the pounding in my chest. It felt like the car was a capsule, suspended in a void where the only reality was the heat where our legs touched. "I hate this part," she murmured. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the fogged window, tracing a line through the condensation with her finger. Her voice was stripped of its usual boardroom cadence. It was just tired. The waiting, the in-between. I looked at her, really looked at her, without the filter of a conference table between us. In the dim, intermittent light of the passing street lamps, the sharp edges of the rival CEO softened. She looked exhausted. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, dark curls escaping the severe bun she'd worn all day. The mascara under her eyes was slightly smudged. She didn't look like a threat to my company's culture, or a variable to be managed. She looked like a woman unraveling at the seams. The bravado was gone, leaving something raw and human in its wake. A dangerous impulse rose in my throat, tight and aching. I wanted to reach out. Not to shake on a deal, not to point at a slide, but to brush the wet hair from her face. I wanted to tell her it was okay to be tired. The urge to comfort her was visceral, a biological imperative that had no place in a merger acquisition. It was terrifying because it wasn't about strategy. It was about care. And care is the one variable you can't hedge against. "It's almost over," I said, my voice slower than I intended, intimate in the small space. She turned then, her eyes locking onto mine. The fatigue was there, but so was something else. A question, a challenge, a plea. "Is it?" she asked. The car jolted over a pothole, throwing us even closer, shoulder to shoulder now. I could smell the rain on her skin. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because looking at her, trapped in this moving capsule of humidity and heat, I knew nothing was over. It was just beginning. The car idled at the curb of her building, the engine sputtering a low, sickly cough that vibrated through the floorboards. The spell of the confined cab broke the moment the driver unlocked the doors. The sound of the rain outside wasn't the rhythmic drumbeat anymore. It was just a cold, miserable downpour waiting to soak us. The warmth we had generated between our bodies, that pressurized heat of proximity, evaporated the second the door opened. Linda stepped out first. I watched her from the dry safety of the back seat, and for the first time since I'd met her, she faltered. The wind caught the heavy glass door of her lobby, wrestling it out of her grip, while the rain lashed at her silk blouse. She was shivering. It wasn't a delicate, polite shiver. It was a full-body tremor that rattled her composure. The Iron Lady of FinTech, the woman who could stare down a boardroom of hostile investors without blinking, was shaking. I didn't think. The careful maneuvering of the last 3 months dissolved under the biological imperative to stop her from being cold. I peeled off my blazer. It was an oversized vintage wool thing, unstructured and chaotic, the complete antithesis of her tailored architectural suits. I scrambled out of the car, ignoring the rain soaking my own thin shirt, and caught her just as she turned back to wave me off. "Take this," I said, shoving the fabric into her hands. She looked at the blazer, then at me, her dark eyes wide with surprise. Raindrops clung to her eyelashes. "Sarah, I can't. I'm fine. You're freezing. Put it on, Linda." My voice was sharper than I intended, breathless with the sudden cold and the adrenaline of the gesture. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then slid her arms into the sleeves. The visual hit me with the force of a physical blow. Seeing her in my clothes changed the power dynamic instantly. The blazer was too big for her in the shoulders. The sleeves fell past her wrists, swallowing her hands. It softened her sharp edges. It made her look smaller, accessible, and maddeningly human. But more than that, it felt possessive. Seeing my fabric wrapped around her body, shielding her from the elements, felt like a claim. I had branded the merger with something personal, something that had nothing to do with equity splits. "I'll have it dry cleaned," she said, pulling the lapels tight across her chest. She looked down at the fabric, her fingers curling into the wool, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to bury her face in it. "I'll return it at the retreat." "Don't worry about it," I managed to say, backing toward the car. "Just get inside." She turned and walked into the lobby, the golden light of the chandelier swallowing her. I watched until the elevator doors closed, cutting the connection. The ride back to my apartment was hollow. I was shivering now, the damp cold settling into my bones, but I barely felt it. I was too busy analyzing the terrifying shift that had just occurred. Giving someone a jacket is a cliché, a simple act of politeness. But this didn't feel polite. It felt like a transaction of intimacy. I had given her a layer of my defense, and she had accepted it. I sat in the empty space where she had been, closing my eyes. I could still feel the phantom weight of her thigh against mine, the ghost of her heat radiating in the dark cab. The air in the car still held a faint trace of her. It was fading, replaced by the smell of wet asphalt and old upholstery, and the loss of it made my chest ache. I had built a career on disruption, on reading patterns and breaking them. But as the city lights blurred past the rain-streaked window, I realized I was the one being disrupted. I wasn't just losing the battle for professional distance. I was surrendering territory I didn't even know I had. She had my blazer. She had my focus. And as the car turned toward my lonely apartment, I knew with a sinking, exhilarating dread that she was starting to have the rest of me too. The weekend retreat was in 3 days. Another hotel, another confined space. The rules were still technically in place, but they felt flimsy now, like a contract written in disappearing ink. I wasn't going there to negotiate a merger anymore. I was going there to get my blazer back, and I was terrified of what else I might take when I did. The executive retreat was situated in a boutique hotel in the Hudson Valley, a place of exposed brick and aggressive minimalism that charged a premium for isolation. It was designed to foster high-level synergy, but as the bellhop left my bag in the suite, it felt more like a beautifully appointed cage. The room assignment was a logistical joke I wasn't laughing at. We were in adjoining suites, separated only by a shared living area and 2 heavy oak doors that had been left unlocked for the sake of workflow efficiency. Efficiency. That was the word we used to justify the fact that I could hear the rhythm of her life through the drywall. I sat at the desk in my room, staring at a spreadsheet that hadn't changed in 20 minutes. The numbers were blurring because my attention was entirely hijacked by the sounds coming from the other side of the wall. I heard the click of her suitcase latch, the heavy thud of shoes being kicked off, and then the rush of water through pipes. The shower. It was a torture I hadn't anticipated. In the boardroom, I could armor myself with data, suits, and the width of a mahogany table. Here, the intimacy was acoustic and unavoidable. I closed my eyes, and the sound of the water painted a picture I had no business seeing. I imagined the steam fogging the mirror, the heat on her skin, the way her hair would look wet and slicked back, stripping away the volume she used as a shield. The boundary felt laughable when I was virtually in the bathroom with her. It was a violation of the treaty we had signed with our eyes months ago, but I couldn't make myself turn on the TV to drown it out. I listened, and I felt the control I prized so highly slipping through my fingers like water. Later, we met in the shared living space. It was neutral ground, decorated in beige and cream, safe and sterile. I had the blazer. I had sent it to a specialist cleaner the morning after the storm, desperate to scrub the evidence of my weakness from the wool. It hung in a plastic bag, pristine and restored to its structural integrity. "Your jacket," I said, holding it out. My voice was steady, but my pulse was a traitor, hammering against my ribs. Sarah looked up from her laptop. She was wearing a silk robe over pajamas, another boundary dissolved by the setting. She stood up and took the hanger. "You didn't have to dry clean it." "I wanted to," I replied, smoothing my own skirt, needing something to do with my hands. "It's only right." She pulled the plastic off. She didn't hang it up immediately. Instead, she brought the fabric to her face, inhaling deeply. It was a brazen, unscripted moment that sucked the air out of the room. Her eyes caught mine over the lapel. "It smells like you now," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a terrifying lack of hesitation. The air in the room condensed. I should have made a joke about the detergent. I should have left. Instead, I sat down on the opposite sofa, the distance between us feeling charged and insufficient. "Sarah," I started, the words tasting like ash. "This merger, the integration plan, what about it?" She lowered the jacket, draping it over her lap like a blanket, keeping it close. "I'm terrified," I admitted. The truth fell out of me before I could sanitize it. I've spent 10 years building a fortress of precision. I'm afraid that by letting your chaos in, I'm not just expanding, I'm destroying the foundation. I'm afraid I won't recognize my own company when this is done. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever said to a living soul, let alone a rival. I braced myself for a strategic pivot, for her to use this weakness to negotiate better terms on the equity split. She didn't. She just looked at me, her gaze soft and unflinching in the dim light of the suite. "You're not destroying it, Linda," she said, her voice dropping to that register that vibrated in my chest. "You're letting it breathe. Foundations are important, but nobody can live in a fortress forever. Sometimes you need to open a window." She didn't move to touch me, but she didn't have to. The way she held my gaze was a touch in itself, warm and lingering. For the first time, I didn't want to rebuild the wall. I wanted to see what would happen if I let it fall. The hotel bar was a dimly lit sanctuary of velvet and shadows, the kind of place designed for secrets and expensive mistakes. The rest of the executive team had long since retreated, taking their celebratory champagne and hollow toasts to the safety of their rooms. But Linda and I remained. We were the last two survivors of the negotiation, nursing the same amber liquid in heavy crystal glasses, caught in the gravity of the corner booth. The armor I had worn for months felt heavy now, corroded by the late hour and the scotch. It was slipping. I watched her across the small candlelit table. She had loosened the top button of her blouse, a microscopic concession to comfort that felt monumental coming from her. She looked less like the architect of a hostile takeover and more like a woman waiting for something to break. "You never talk about it," I said, my voice cutting through the low hum of the room. It wasn't the alcohol talking. It was the exhaustion of pretending. The life outside the ledger. Who waits for you, Linda? Who gets the version of you that isn't optimizing for efficiency? She stopped swirling her drink. Her eyes, usually so guarded, snapped up to mine. There was a challenge there, but it was softer than before, blurred by the atmosphere. "I value privacy," she said, the standard deflection. But the steel was gone from her tone. "Privacy is just another word for isolation," I countered, leaning in. The space between us on the banquette was shrinking, not by physics, but by intent. "You build these walls to keep people out, but what are you actually protecting inside them?" She didn't answer immediately. She took a sip, and I watched the movement of her throat, the way the light caught the hollow of her neck. When she lowered the glass, she didn't look at my eyes. She looked at my mouth. It was a fleeting glance, a fraction of a second where her focus dropped to my lips before snapping back up. But I saw it. In the high-stakes economy of our relationship, That look was a scream. It was an unveiling. The woman of binary choices was hungry. The atmosphere shifted instantly, heavy with a sudden, violent clarity. She wanted this. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stripping the air from my lungs. I should have looked away. I should have made a joke about the merger and called for the check. Instead, I reached out. My hand found her forearm, resting on the cool silk of her sleeve. Underneath, I could feel the tension in her muscle, the heat of her skin radiating through the fabric. It wasn't a handshake. It was an anchor. "Sarah," she breathed. It wasn't a warning. It was a question. My thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, finding the pulse point. It was racing, hammering a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my skin that matched my own. We stayed like that for 10 seconds that stretched into an eternity. The world narrowed down to that single point of contact, the heat traveling up my arm and settling heavy in my chest. I could lean in. I could close the gap. The trajectory was clear, the outcome inevitable. And that was exactly why I couldn't do it. The terror washed over me, cold and sobering. If I kissed her now, here, with the ink on the merger still wet, there was no going back. I would lose the only leverage I had left, the illusion that I was in control. I wasn't ready to be consumed. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. The loss of contact was jarring, a physical severance that left my skin tingling. "I have an early flight," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. We should call it." The disappointment in her eyes was a mirror of my own, raw and unflinching. But I turned away before it could break me. I stood up, the movement abrupt and clumsy, breaking the spell we had woven. I left her sitting in the shadows of the booth, walking out of the bar without looking back, terrified that if I turned around, I would never leave. The elevator ride back to my room was a vacuum of sound, the numbers climbing slowly, counting down the seconds until I could breathe again. But even as the doors closed, sealing me in, I knew the escape was temporary. The silence that awaited us back in the city would be louder than anything we had said tonight. The silence that followed the retreat wasn't the peaceful quiet of a closed deal. It was the suffocating pressure of a vacuum. 3 days. 72 hours of radio silence, where the only communication between us was routed through legal counsel and redlined PDFs. The merger was technically entering its most critical phase, the finalization of the asset transfer, but the energy had vanished. It was as if the electricity had been cut to the building, leaving us all working by the dim light of emergency power. I sat at the head of the table in my glass-walled conference room, listening to my general counsel drone on about liability clauses. The city skyline was a gray smear behind him, obscured by a low-hanging fog. Usually, this was my symphony, the precise, dry language of corporate law, the certainty of binding agreements. But today, the words were just noise. I caught myself staring at the empty chair at the far end of the table. Sarah's chair. She had called into the meeting, her voice disembodied and strictly professional, coming through the Polycom speaker. She sounded efficient, distant, like a stranger reading a script. I missed the chaos. I missed the way she would interrupt a lawyer to ask a question that cut straight to the human truth of the deal. I missed the scent of sandalwood that used to linger in the room long after she left. The victory I had spent months engineering felt hollow. I had won the negotiation. I had protected my company's culture. I had maintained the boundaries. And I felt a profound, aching sense of loss that no spreadsheet could quantify. The realization was slow and terrifying. The professional friction hadn't been an obstacle to the work. It was the work. Without it, the acquisition was just ink on paper. It was Tuesday night when the dam finally broke. I was lying in bed, the room dark, save for the ambient glow of the city filtering through the sheer curtains. My phone sat on the nightstand, a black monolith I had checked 40 times in the last hour. I told myself I was monitoring international markets. I told myself I was waiting for an update from the London team. I was lying. At 11:42 p.m., the screen lit up. It didn't ring. It was a single, short vibration that sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet room. My heart hammered a rhythm that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with the name on the screen. Sarah. There was no subject line, no hello, no regarding the merger, no preamble. Just an address in the warehouse district, a part of the city where the streetlights were sparse and the lofts were vast. Below it, a 4-digit gate code, 9928. It was a coordinate, a location. But in the language we had been speaking for months, the language of glances and half-finished sentences, it was a surrender. It was a white flag and an invitation to war all at once. She wasn't asking me to review a document. She was telling me where she was and leaving the variable of what to do about it entirely in my hands. Logic, my old armor, tried to intervene. It whispered about the 8 a.m. stakeholder call. It cited the HR policies regarding fraternization I had written myself. It reminded me that I was the CEO of a fintech firm and she was the acquisition target. But the logic sounded tinny and distant, like a radio playing in another room. The data was irrelevant. The only metric that mattered was the blue light glowing against my palm. I didn't overthink it. For the first time in my career, I didn't run a risk assessment. I got up. I didn't bother with the suit armor. I pulled on a trench coat over jeans, grabbing my keys with a hand that wasn't quite steady. The drive was a blur of sodium lights and wet asphalt. I drove with a reckless kind of precision, weaving through the late-night traffic, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. Every mile marker stripped away another layer of the distance I had fought so hard to maintain. The closer I got to the coordinates, the harder my heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't fear. It was the terrifying, exhilarating realization that I was finally driving toward the collision instead of away from it. My apartment had never felt this large. Or this quiet. It was a converted industrial loft, a space of exposed beams and concrete floors that usually felt expansive and liberating. Tonight, it felt like a waiting room for a verdict I wasn't sure I could survive. I had paced the length of the main room 40 times, my bare feet silent against the reclaimed wood, tracing a path of anxiety that mirrored the chaotic loops of my own thoughts. Sending that text was the most reckless thing I had ever done. It wasn't a calculated risk. It was a demolition of the very architecture we had spent months building. I stopped by the window, looking down at the empty street 3 stories below. The streetlights cast long amber shadows against the brickwork of the warehouse opposite mine. I checked my phone again. No reply. Just the glowing evidence of my own vulnerability staring back at me. I realized then that the merger meant nothing. The valuation, the exit strategy, the legacy, it was all just paper. If I signed those final documents on Friday without acknowledging the gravitational pull that had been distorting my orbit for 3 months, I would be the richest fraud in the city. I wasn't merging companies. I was trying to merge a version of myself that didn't exist anymore, with a woman who saw right through it. I needed her to show up. Not the CEO of the acquiring firm, but the woman who had shivered in the rain and looked at my mouth in the hotel bar. The buzzer screamed through the loft, a harsh, jagged sound that made me jump. My heart slammed against my ribs, a sudden, violent kick of adrenaline. She was here. I walked to the intercom, my hand trembling as I pressed the button to release the gate. I didn't ask who it was. I knew. The wait for the elevator to climb 3 floors was an agonizing stretch of time where every second felt like a held breath. I stood by the heavy steel door, smoothing my hands over my jeans, trying to ground myself in the physical reality of the moment. The air in the hallway shifted before the elevator even dinged. A change in pressure, a subtle charge that signaled her proximity. When the knock came, it was soft, hesitant. I pulled the heavy door open. Linda stood on the threshold. She was stripped of the armor I had come to expect. No tailored suit, no briefcase, no severe bun. She was wearing a trench coat, belted over jeans, her hair loose and falling around her face in dark waves that softened the sharp angles of her jaw. She looked windblown and real, a terrifyingly human figure standing against the industrial gray of the hallway. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, as if she had run the last few steps. We stared at each other across the threshold. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. But it wasn't the empty silence of the boardroom. It was the loaded silence of a fuse burning down. She didn't step in. She waited, respecting the boundary of my home even after I had given her the coordinates to breach it. "I thought we had rules," she said. Her voice was low, rougher than usual, stripped of its corporate polish. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question, offering me one last chance to retreat, to claim it was a mistake, to close the door and go back to the safety of the ledger. I looked at her, at the dark eyes that had haunted my focus for months, at the mouth I had watched across a candlelit table, at the hands buried deep in her pockets that I knew were clenched into fists. I stepped back, widening the opening, abandoning the last line of defense I had. "I lied," I breathed. The tension between us snapped. Linda crossed the threshold in a single stride, kicking the door shut behind her with a definitive thud that echoed through the loft. She didn't wait for permission. She reached for me, her hands finding the lapels of my shirt, pulling me in with a desperation that shattered the last 3 months of restraint. The first touch was electric, a searing confirmation of everything we had denied. Her skin was cold from the night air, but her mouth was hot, demanding, and unflinching. It wasn't a tentative exploration. It was a collision. I wound my arms around her neck, burying my hands in her hair, pulling her closer until there was no space left for logic or strategy. The kiss claimed everything: the arguments, the silence, the stolen glances, the fear. It was messy and desperate and perfect. We stumbled back against the wall, the impact knocking the breath out of me, but I didn't care. I was finally, terrifyingly, exactly where I was supposed to be. The merger was complete. Waking up in a space that wasn't mine usually triggered a fight-or-flight response. My life was calibrated to a specific frequency: my sheets, my alarm, my temperature control. But waking up in Sarah's loft felt less like a disruption and more like a necessary recalibration. The morning light was pouring in through the uncurtained warehouse windows, harsh and unfiltered, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It should have annoyed me. Instead, I lay there, watching the chaos of the light, feeling an unfamiliar heaviness in my limbs that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with peace. Sarah was asleep beside me. The duvet was tangled around her legs, a testament to a restless sleeper, but her face was still. In the boardroom, she was always in motion, tapping a pen, shifting her weight, her eyes darting between data points. Here, in the quiet of 7 a.m., she was static, unguarded. Her hair was a dark halo against the pillow, messy and real. I traced the line of her shoulder with my eyes, marveling at the contrast. The architect of my professional headaches, the woman who challenged my every projection, looked impossibly soft. It was a data point I hadn't factored in, the vulnerability beneath the kinetic energy. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards cool under my feet. The loft was a landscape of her personality. Books stacked haphazardly, art leaning against walls rather than hung, a half-finished circuit board on the dining table. I found the kitchen by instinct and the coffee machine by necessity. It was a manual press, of course, nothing automated. I went through the ritual of grinding beans, the mechanical noise loud in the quiet space, grounding me. When I turned around, she was leaning against the doorframe. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt that hung off one shoulder, her eyes sleepy but alert. She didn't say good morning. She just watched me, a small smile playing on her lips that felt like a secret. "You operate a French press with the same intensity you use to audit a quarterly report," she noted, her voice raspy with sleep. I poured 2 mugs. Precision matters, even with caffeine. I handed her a cup, our fingers brushing against the ceramic. The spark was still there, undiluted by the morning light. But the desperation of the night before had settled into a steady, humming warmth. We stood in the kitchen, the steam rising between us. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. But the reality of the calendar hung over us. "The signing is at 2, I said, taking a sip. The coffee was strong, bitter, and perfect. "The lawyers will be there, the press." Sarah blew on her coffee, her gaze steady over the rim. "Technically, this," she gestured between us with the mug, "is a massive conflict of interest, a disclosure nightmare. If HR knew, they'd have an aneurysm." "Strictly speaking," I replied, falling back into the language of risk assessment, It's a material change in the relationship dynamics, a variable that compromises objectivity.
Do you feel compromised? She asked.
I looked at her. I thought about the cold perfection of my apartment, the silence of my car, the defenses I had built around my life. Then I looked at the woman standing in a sunlit kitchen, drinking coffee I made, wearing a shirt that revealed the curve of her collarbone. I didn't feel compromised. I felt fortified. I started, choosing the words with care, that the previous strategy was flawed. Isolation isn't a competitive advantage. Sarah set her mug down and stepped into my space. The distance closed effortlessly. She rested her hands on my waist, grounding me. So, do we disclose? Not yet, I decided. The strategist in me took the wheel, but the destination had changed. The deal needs to close on its own merits. The market needs stability. But the strictly professional rule? That's rescinded. Burned.
I like the sound of that, she murmured, leaning in to press a kiss to my jaw.
It was soft, domestic, a promise rather than a proposition. We keep it ours. For now.
Ours, I echoed.
The word felt strange on my tongue, singular and plural at once. We finished the coffee in the quiet of the loft, moving around each other with a natural rhythm that shouldn't have been possible after one night, yet felt inevitable. Getting dressed felt like putting on a costume. I buttoned my shirt, smoothed my trench coat, and watched Sarah pull on a blazer. My blazer, I realized with a jolt of satisfaction. She caught me looking and winked.
Ready to go to war, Linda? She asked, grabbing her keys.
No, I said, opening the door and holding it for her. I'm ready to sign a peace treaty.
We walked out into the hallway together, the heavy steel door clicking shut on the sanctuary we had created.
The elevator ride down was silent, but as we stood side by side watching the numbers descend, her hand brushed the back of mine. I didn't pull away. I let the contact linger, a secret tether anchoring me to the earth. The car was waiting. The board was waiting. But for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't walking into the office alone.
The boardroom was a theater of performative seriousness. A sterile aquarium of glass and polished mahogany where the air was recycled and the stakes were calculated in 9 figures. 20 people filled the space. Lawyers in charcoal suits, investors checking their watches, and a handful of industry press hovering near the back with cameras ready. It was the culmination of 6 months of warring strategies, the final act of the acquisition. Usually, surrendering the autonomy of the company I had built from a laptop in a coffee shop to a fintech giant would have felt like a funeral. I should have been mourning the loss of my independence. Instead, I sat there feeling a strange, vibrating thrill that had absolutely nothing to do with the check clearing. I looked across the expanse of the table. Linda was there, centered perfectly against the backdrop of the city skyline. She had reassembled herself with terrifying precision. The trench coat and jeans from the night before were gone, replaced by a tailored navy suit that looked like it could deflect bullets. Her hair was pinned back in that severe architectural style that screamed control. To the room, she was the unshakable CEO, the predator who had successfully hunted down the competition. To me, she was the woman who had stood in my kitchen in a t-shirt 3 hours ago, smelling of my coffee and looking soft in the morning light. The dissonance was dizzying. It was a secret that felt heavy and hot in my chest, a live wire running under the floorboards that only we could feel. I watched her listen to the general counsel drone on about liability clauses. Her face was a mask of professional engagement, her posture rigid. But then she reached for her water glass, and I saw the microscopic hesitation in her movement when she caught my eye. It was a signal, a crack in the armor visible only to someone who had spent the night dismantling it. The space between us, which used to be a sheet of ice, had transformed into a conduit. Every time she adjusted her glasses or smoothed a page of the contract, I felt a phantom echo of those hands on my skin. The memory of her touch, desperate and claiming in the hallway, gentle and domestic in the kitchen, was more vivid than the reality of the lawyers flanking me. We were playing a game of high-stakes poker,
where everyone else was looking at the cards, but we were the only ones who knew the game had changed entirely.
"If all parties are ready," the lawyer said, sliding the heavy binders across the table. The cameras flashed, a strobe light effect that fractured the moment into white-hot stills.
I watched Linda pick up the pen. It was a heavy, expensive instrument, designed to give weight to history. I watched the muscles in her forearm flex as she signed her name, the precise, deliberate loop of the letters. It was hypnotic. I remembered those same fingers tangled in my hair, gripping my waist with a hunger that defied this calm exterior. The contrast was intoxicating. It felt possessive. Let the world have the CEO. I knew the woman who existed when the lights went out. I took the pen she offered me. Our fingers brushed, a fleeting, accidental contact to anyone watching, but a thunderclap to us. I signed my name. The ink was black and permanent. I was signing away my company, merging my chaotic creativity with her structural precision. The deal was done. The press murmured, the investors clapped, and the lawyers exhaled. But as I looked up and locked eyes with Linda, I knew the truth. The market would call this a business acquisition. They would analyze the synergies and the stock value. They would never know that the real negotiation hadn't happened at this table. The merger was successful, but the real acquisition was the woman sitting across from me. We had signed a deal far more binding than the paper between us.
The elevator doors slid shut, finally cutting off the noise of the press and the congratulations of the board. The silence was instant, heavy, and perfect. We were alone. The professional facade dropped like a heavy curtain. Linda didn't look at the floor numbers. She looked at me. Her hand found mine in the dim light, interlacing our fingers with a familiarity that felt years old. The work was just beginning, and the line was gone forever. If you've ever broken a rule for the right person, subscribe for more stories.